While we've all witnessed baskets of goods becoming increasingly expensive around the world and inflation eating away at families' savings, there is one country where the main concern is quite the opposite. Prices are no longer rising slowly, they are falling every month. Supermarkets have to update product labels to show a lower price. We're talking about the jewel in Europe's crown, Switzerland. Inflation took off during the COVID crisis, as it did in every other country. And when I say took off, I mean by Swiss standards, because it didn't even reach 4% at its peak. By comparison, the US and the Eurozone saw figures above 10%. But now, inflation is back in negative territory, and believe me, this is not at all popular in Switzerland. In Switzerland, the word deflation sounds almost like blasphemy. They're so afraid of it that the Swiss National Bank, yes, their own central bank, has already lowered interest rates to 0%. And pay attention, because it doesn't end there. Analysts such as those at Goldman Sachs believe that, in the coming months, rates could enter negative territory. Yeah, you heard correctly, negative interest rates. While in Europe and the United States, the cost of debt is around 4%, in Switzerland, they pay you to go into debt. Imagine this, you buy a house with a mortgage of 300,000 euros, and 30 years later, you keep the house having only paid 250,000 euros. A bargain, right? Well, be careful. It's not all that wonderful. Negative interest rates are also unpopular in Switzerland. So, politicians have been forced to choose between the bad, below zero interest rates, and the worst, deflation. And as if that weren't enough, Bern now faces another open front. Donald Trump's tariffs are turning the Swiss economy upside down and tying the Swiss National Bank's hands. By the way, did you know that this bank is listed on the stock exchange like any other company? This is not just a curious detail. The bank's relationship with the stock market is one of the key factors to this whole story. As we'll see later, Switzerland invests in stocks to avoid inflation. In this video, we want to focus on these questions. Why are prices falling in Switzerland? What happens if rates continue to fall? And what does Donald Trump have to do with all this? Today on Visualeconomik, we'll tell you all about it. Switzerland has fewer than 10 million inhabitants, but even so, it has earned a place in the pantheon of model countries. The Swiss are wealthy, egalitarian, have all their basic needs covered, and on top of that, they make chocolate that is to die for. You all know Swiss brands such as Nestle and Rolex, but there's also Novartis, one of the titans of the pharmaceutical sector, and ABB, a leader in industrial automation. Basically, half the planet wants to be like Switzerland. And there are plenty of reasons why. Neither COVID nor the war in Ukraine has managed to trigger an inflationary spiral there. Nothing. It's almost as if they were living in an anti-crisis bubble. And don't think this was an exception. Over the last 20 years, inflation in Switzerland has barely exceeded 1%. That's half the target pursued by the European Central Bank or the Federal Reserve. Now, what if we told you that Switzerland has been printing money like crazy for years? That's right. In just 2 decades, the money supply in circulation has increased 8-fold. 8 times more money moving through the economy. And no, we're not talking about Peronist Argentina or Chavista Venezuela. We're talking about Switzerland. The Swiss franc is such a valuable, sought-after currency that no matter how much you print, there will always be people eager to buy it. What's more, despite the sharp increase in its supply, this currency has continued to appreciate. In 2008, 1 Swiss franc bought 0.6 euros. Today, it buys more than 1, and it continues to rise. And Visualeconomik community, this is the key to the dilemma. It's true that there are other countries fighting deflation. Look at Japan and China, but these are completely different cases. In those countries, deflation is the result of bad policies and an economic situation that could be improved. But in Switzerland, the opposite is true. They have deflation because their situation is good. The country is so rich and its institutions are so solid that everyone wants to benefit. How? Well, among other things, by buying Swiss francs, especially when things in the rest of the world are not going so well. And obviously, that drives up the value of the currency. Or, to put it another way, it makes foreign products cheaper. What's more, as you can see from this chart taken from a report by the central bank itself, imports are solely responsible for Swiss deflation. While domestic prices are rising, albeit perhaps too slowly, imported products are becoming cheaper and cheaper. And since Switzerland is such a small country, it has to import a lot of products, so the basket of goods becomes cheaper on average. The problem, when the Swiss franc appreciates, Swiss products become more expensive for the rest of the world, and more expensive means less competitive. And here's the crucial fact: Switzerland exports 65% of its GDP, so you can imagine why deflation and an overly strong currency are not at all welcome in the country. But wait, there's more. With inflation, your savings lose value, so either you invest or you watch your money slowly evaporate. And with deflation, just the opposite. Money becomes more and more valuable. It's like getting paid to hide it under your mattress. So what happens in that situation? Well, if everything is going to be cheaper tomorrow, I'd better wait until tomorrow to buy. And when tomorrow comes, I tell myself the same thing, and the next day as well. The result? No one buys anything. Products remain on the shelves, and companies go under. Do they try to take out a loan to stay afloat? Well, good luck with that. Since everyone is hoarding their money like gold dust, there's no credit for anyone. The outcome? Crisis and economic stagnation. Now, you're probably not surprised to learn that major economic crises have been deflationary, such as the one in 2008 or the Great Depression. But keep in mind, this doesn't mean that all deflation is bad. If prices fall because we're more productive or because global trade is working better, great. But in this case, there's neither increased productivity nor new consumption habits. What we have is a distortion caused by a currency that is skyrocketing out of control, and that's not all. One of the big problems with deflation is that not all prices adjust equally when the value of money changes, and that lack of coordination can be lethal. Do you know which price is the most rigid of all? That's right. Wages. And the worst thing is that this rigidity is asymmetrical. Raising wages is 1,000, no, 1,000,000 times easier than lowering them. Take a look at this study on the Swiss case.
The larger drop in employment incomes can be explained by the fact that unemployment benefits replace part of these incomes if an individual with rigid wages loses their job. In fact, the probability of becoming unemployed is 1.2 percentage points higher for individuals with rigid wages.
In short, I'm sure you now understand why the Swiss authorities are so determined to combat deflation. Over the last decade, Switzerland has been growing at a much slower pace than the Eurozone. It's true that Switzerland is very wealthy and that rich countries tend to grow more slowly, but Swiss households have a significantly lower median disposable income than their US counterparts, and Uncle Sam grew at twice the rate during that period. The Swiss central bank's explanation is clear. Deflation and the strength of the Swiss franc are entirely to blame. But wait a minute, deflation is bad, but negative interest rates are not exactly a panacea either. The idea behind it is simple. You subsidize borrowing. In other words, you encourage people to borrow and spend more. Consume like crazy to see if prices go up. The problem, the first to suffer are the banks. They used to charge for holding Swiss francs in their reserves. Now, they have to pay for it, but the damage goes far beyond the banking sector. Many pension funds were heavily invested in Swiss debt and similar assets, which, with negative rates, are now worth less than half their former value. The result, Switzerland has gone from having one of the best funded pension systems on the planet to a system with cracks that are increasingly difficult to ignore. And there's more. Negative interest rates also distort the entire economy. People start taking their money out of banks and putting it into tangible assets such as housing. I'm sure I don't need to tell you what can happen when easy credit and monetary policy-driven investment in housing are combined. Right, well, exactly that. And we're not just talking about bricks and mortar. Switzerland has also become one of the biggest art collectors, at least in proportion to its size. Is it because the Swiss are all patrons of the arts with refined tastes? Well, maybe a little, but it's also because with interest rates at minus 0.75% for years, art has become a kind of decorative safe where you could store your money without it losing value. So is Switzerland caught between a rock and a hard place? Is there no good way out? Well, surprise, yes. There is. For years, the Swiss Confederation has been pursuing a third way. Do you know what it is? Investing in the stock market. And that explains news stories like this one.
SNB posts $50 billion profit on boost from Apple and Amazon. Swiss monetary policymakers have accumulated huge amounts of foreign currency assets as part of a battle to hold down the value of the franc. The federal government and cantons will now receive 4 billion Swiss francs from the SNB, double the amount previously paid out, as part of a special agreement struck to cover 2019 and 2020.
Let's remember, the problem is that everyone wants to have Swiss francs. And of course, Switzerland is not going to impose capital controls. Basically because if it did, it would cease to be Switzerland and become Argentina. So faced with the avalanche of demand, the Swiss opted for the following. You want francs? Well, have some francs. And they fearlessly fired up the printing press, banknotes and more banknotes, but with an interesting twist. All that money did not stay within the country. They exchanged it for other currencies, and wait for it, stocks. In 2013, the Swiss National Bank's portfolio was worth around $20 billion. Today, it exceeds $140 billion. In other words, that's around 15,000 euros for every Swiss citizen. Not bad, right? In fact, the central bank is so involved in the markets that 90% of Swiss francs are backed by stocks, bonds, and other financial assets. Want to know what they're invested in? Well, their main equity positions are Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, Google, and Tesla, in that order. Truth be told, there are no surprises here. Now, make no mistake, this is not a Norwegian-style sovereign wealth fund. Swiss bankers hate that label.
Sovereign wealth fund, not a good idea, says Swiss central bank.
This point is crucial. Sovereign wealth funds basically invest a country's extraordinary savings, but the Swiss central bank is not investing any savings, it is creating money to exchange for stocks, bonds, and foreign currencies. What matters is not the profits generated by all these assets, but rather meeting the immense foreign demand for Swiss francs.
Foreign exchange reserves do not really represent savings, since they serve the SNB's monetary policy. If the situation required it, the Swiss central bank could be forced to reduce them, which implies unrestricted access to this liquidity.
This visual economic community is Switzerland's secret weapon for combating deflation without overusing negative interest rates. That said, Switzerland has still had much more deflation than it would have liked in recent years, and rates were at negative 0.75% for 5 years in a row, but without stock market operations, things would have been much worse. Nevertheless, the jewel in the European crown has a new problem, one that is called Donald Trump. From Washington, the Republican president continues his trade crusade. The problem? Well, Switzerland has been the hardest hit of all the developed countries. Pay attention to this figure, 39%. That's the general tariff that the United States has imposed on Swiss exports. A mere trifle. It's true that exports of gold and pharmaceuticals are exempt from tariffs, and these are two of Switzerland's main exports. In the end, the average tariff rate could remain around 12%. But don't be fooled by this figure. Despite this 12%, many Swiss companies will have to compete against other foreign companies with a 39% tariff. On top of that, many fear that a tariff on the pharmaceutical sector is just around the corner. At the beginning of July, there was still a certain amount of optimism in Bern. They were about to sign a trade agreement with the US, similar to the one they signed with the UK. Was it a good agreement? No, it was considerably worse than the situation before Trump. But obviously, it was better than a 39% tariff that took the entire Swiss government by surprise. The reason? You can probably guess. Switzerland has a trade surplus with the United States. And, to top it all off, it's on Trump's blacklist for allegedly manipulating its currency. And yes, it's true that the Swiss intervene in the foreign exchange market. We've seen it with the stock market. And they also sell francs and buy dollars to devalue their currency. But let's not fool ourselves. The goal is not to devalue in order to gain competitiveness by force, but to prevent the currency from appreciating too much. Donald Trump is accusing the Swiss of competitive devaluation, at the same time that the dollar has devalued more than 10% against the Swiss franc in less than a year. It just doesn't make any sense. And keep in mind that according to the US congressional report from which we took the previous graph, the Swiss franc is neither overvalued nor artificially undervalued. Yet, this conflicts with other indicators, such as the famous Big Mac index, which indicates that the franc is 50% overvalued. In any case, what is clear is that Uncle Sam has it in for the Swiss, and although Switzerland is rich, it's still a small country with little capacity to stand up to the United States. The result? The Swiss National Bank is now treading carefully. It is afraid to continue operating on the stock market or other financial markets in case the Trump administration interprets this as currency manipulation and responds with more tariffs. But if it doesn't intervene, the only alternative is to lower interest rates significantly, and we've already seen the problems that this entails. fails. For now, Switzerland is in standby mode, because with Trump, who knows, maybe tomorrow he'll make another big move, and then back down again. Trump always chickens out, you know, the good old taco. Most analysts believe that rates will remain at 0%, but Goldman Sachs goes further. It gives a 40% chance that they will return to negative 0.75%, the same level that was reached after the famous franc shock. It doesn't ring a bell? Well, pay attention. The franc shock erupted when the Swiss central bank removed the exchange rate floor it had imposed on itself against the euro. At that very moment, the ECB was about to launch its quantitative easing program, and Switzerland did not have the financial muscle to keep its currency stable in the face of such a tsunami of euros. Overnight, 100 euros went from being able to buy 120 francs to less than 100, and then stabilized at around 110, a drop of 14%. Since then, the Swiss Confederation has grown much more slowly than its European neighbors, even though it had been doing extremely well in previous years. These days, the situation is more under control, but the central bank has not ruled out intervention. Even a country as utopian as Switzerland has its problems, so don't be surprised if we see another long period of negative interest rates. But now that we've reached this point, it's your turn. Did you know that deflation has returned to Switzerland? What do you think of Switzerland's strategy to control the value of its currency by investing in the stock market? Do you think Trump will put an end to this strategy, or will it all be a bluff? You can leave your answers in the comments. Don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe if you haven't already to make sure you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. If you like this video, hit like, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, see you next time.